Dr. Benjamin Carson, who we already heard from this morning, will be one of the panel members, a former member of the Academy, the class of 1994. Come on up, gentlemen. Dr. Francis Collins, whom has been referred to already this morning. He's passing me right now for discovering the development of the gene mapping techniques. Dr. Richard Dawkins. I think, Kathleen, you're going to give a more thorough introduction. Should I continue it? All right. Let me just give you a little bit about Dr. Dawkins. He is being inducted into this year's class, 2006, one of the most influential scientists of our time. He was born in East Africa. He knew that before Dr. Wells had traced it for him, and grew up fascinated with animal behavior. At Oxford, he fused the study of animal behavior with molecular biology and brought about a radical change of perspective in evolutionary theory, posting the gene itself rather than the larger organism as the object of natural selection. He has been called Darwin's Rottweiler for his passionate defense of evolutionary theory. His upcoming book is called The God Delusion, from Oxford, England, now being inducted this year, Dr. Richard Dawkins. And also joining us on stage is another member of the class this year, Daniel C. Dennett, a brilliant guide to the frontiers of cognitive science. Dr. Dennett has drawn on the latest findings in neurology, psychology, linguistics, computer science, and artificial intelligence to explain the phenomenon of consciousness itself. One of his latest books is Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon. The director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University, Daniel Dennett. And all of that is to discuss, we've looked at science all morning, now we're going to throw in faith. And what does that mean, science and faith, and the conflicts in some people's minds. Moderating that, are you still with WJLA? Mm-hmm. From Washington, D.C., a good friend of the Academy, Kathleen Matthews, a 21-year veteran of television news in Washington, news anchor at WJLA, those of you who have been in Washington, an ABC affiliate. She's been awarded 9 Emmys for news documentaries and for a nationally syndicated program, Working Women. And incidentally, her last name Matthews is because she is married to Chris Matthews. But she's a lot nicer than Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, Kathleen Matthews.
Thanks very much. Dr. Carson told us to get out of our safety zone, and that's what we're going to do right now. That's what this panel is all about. I'm actually a news broadcaster who wanted to be a brain surgeon, but I was failed by my pre-med courses first year at Stanford University, so now I get to ask questions to neurosurgeons, doctors, and scientists. But it's great to be here. As a news broadcaster, every night our shows are filled with medical breakthroughs. This is what people really want to hear about today. But we also have in the headlines so often the collision of science and religion. Embryonic stem cell research is a great example of that. And so that's what we want to talk about today. And so for each of our panelists, and Ben, let me start with you. What I'd like you to do is very briefly talk about the work you do and how your faith informs your science and how the science informs your faith.
Okay, well, as a neurosurgeon, obviously I spend a lot of time dealing with the brain and the nervous system, and I've been extraordinarily impressed by how complex it is. I'm also very much interested in human development and social development of individuals. And as a pediatric neurosurgeon, spend a lot of time dealing with children and dealing with human potential. And when I combine that with the scientific background, I tend to think that human beings are very different from other creatures. And I think that's probably where I differentiate with some of my colleagues here on the panel who tend to think that it's all one continuum. However, when you look at the human brain and you look at what we're capable of, there is an extra sense of what I call spirituality, something that takes us beyond what an ape or a dog or a cat or a mouse is able to do, that makes us special, that makes us in charge of the environment in which we live. And I remember once I was talking about that in an article in Parade magazine, and a guy wrote in and said that I was a species, not a racist, a species, because I was indicating that there was something special about human beings versus other animals. But I'll be very interested to hear what those who disagree with that believe.
Dr. Richard Dawkins, if you would tell us a little bit about your work as an evolutionary biologist and also your new book, The God Delusion, which I think tells the audience here where you come from.
I believe that the existence of a supreme being, a supernatural God, is a scientific hypothesis like any other. The universe with a supreme creator would be a totally different kind of universe from one without. And therefore, I have no patience at all with those among my colleagues who say something like, science and religion have nothing to do with each other, they don't come into collision with each other, they are about totally different things. They are about the same thing. They're about the nature of the universe, and they can't both be. It can't both be true that there is a supreme being and that there is not. That is a scientific question. Whether we'll ever be able to answer it with certainty by scientific means isn't clear, but it is a scientific question. Now, one of the main ways in which, from a scientific point of view, people try to demonstrate the existence of a God is what can be called the argument from improbability. If you look at most of the scientific arguments, such as they are, for God, they're actually arguments against evolution. And it's very easy to see why this is, because Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is a stunning example of a reversal in human thought historically. Before Darwin came along, it was possible to say, because living things are so amazingly complicated and improbable in a statistical sense, therefore there has to be a creator. What Darwin did was to blow that argument out of the water. Incredibly, as it must have seemed, Darwin showed that it is possible to get things as complicated as the human brain, as all the wonderful things we've been hearing about, by totally non-designed means. You start with a very, very simple beginning, and you work up by gradual degrees, every one of which is explicable and understood, to the prodigies of complexity that we see in the living world. Now, Darwin, of course, only dealt with the living world. He didn't deal with the cosmos. And we need a completely different kind of explanation for the universe. But I see Darwinism as a consciousness raiser. It raises our consciousness as a species to the power of science to explain things which would otherwise have seemed completely inexplicable. And the final thing I want to say is that when people use the argument from improbability, they do it in a rather, not intentionally dishonest, but amounts to a dishonest way. The form of the argument goes like this. We have discovered, they say, a gap in, for example, Darwin's theory. There's something you can't explain. The elbow joint of the lesser-spotted weasel frog has never been explained. Therefore, God must have done it. Now, notice the dishonesty in that kind of logic. You say we have two hypotheses. Hypothesis A, evolution, hypothesis B, God. We think we found a flaw in hypothesis A. We don't even look to see whether hypothesis B can solve the problem. We just say by default, therefore hypothesis B must be right. That's no way to do science. On the contrary, the hypothesis that a divine designer did it is itself postulating a being of staggering improbability in his own right. And whatever arguments one deploys against evolution will backfire 100-fold against the theory of the divine designer.
Dr. Daniel Dennett is an expert in cognitive sciences, literally explains consciousness. So explain, do you agree with what you've just heard?
I agree with a lot that both of them said, both Dr. Carson and Richard Dawkins. Dr. Carson said that when he looks at the human brain, he sees something that really distinguishes it sharply from all other creatures. It's not so much what he finds in the brain, it's what the brain can do. And I agree that the human species is really on a different plane from all other species. He uses the word spirituality. I would say it's because of language and culture, and that these are themselves evolved features of our world, and they can be studied using the Darwinian perspective. And that what we need to do now is to study, using the methods of science, just exactly the methods that we saw. For instance, Spencer Wells' wonderful map that opened his talk. We also need maps that trace human languages and human cultures. These are evolved products of the biosphere. They are fruits on the tree of life in exactly the same way that every organism and every apple is a fruit on the tree of life. When we study the evolution of faith, we learn many interesting things. My most recent book is about studying the evolution of faith and distinguishing rather sharply between the ancestral faiths, the faiths such as they must have been of those early humans moving out of Africa, and organized religions, which came along much later. They're a very recent phenomenon on the planet, only a few thousand years old, about the same age as agriculture, maybe 10,000 years at most. And there are adaptations. Religions have adapted to fit that wonderful human brain that we've heard so much about. And if we study religions, we can reverse engineer religions the same way we reverse engineer organisms and their parts. And we can learn from studying the evolution of faith how it's come to be such a powerful force in the world. And the reason that we need to do that is that in the 21st century, it is perhaps the most powerful social phenomenon. And if we don't understand it from top to bottom, we risk making some well-intentioned but terrible mistakes as we try to plot our future in this century.
Dr. Francis Collins successfully explained to my viewers in 1 minute and 40 seconds how he mapped the human genome and why that was significant. So I give you about the same amount of time to explain how your faith informs your science.
A tough challenge, Kathleen. It's a privilege to be on a panel with such distinguished presenters. And those of you listening to this conversation could probably not happen anywhere on the planet except right here. This is a very interesting aspect of this particular year's meeting. I have had the privilege of leading the effort that read out the 3 billion letters of the Human DNA Instruction Book, the Human Genome, working with thousands of scientists from all over the world. That is leading us in a fashion that I think we're all very excited about and has been referred to already this morning in terms of personalized medicine. The idea that each of us will be able, in the not too distant future, not only to know a little bit about various variants in our Y and chromosome or our mitochondria, but maybe our entire genome for less than $1,000. It's a very, very real possibility in the course of the next 10 or 15 years. So how are we going to deal with all that information? I'm also, though, in the 40% of my colleagues who believe in a God to whom one can pray in expectation of an answer. I'm a believer. I was not always so. I would have been very comfortable with Professor Dawkins and Dennett's positions until I was 27, because I was an atheist for most of my younger life. And what brought me to a change in that view was a realization that I'd never really considered the evidence for and against faith. And so, when challenged about that while I was a medical student, I decided I ought to know a little bit more about what exactly faith represents. And I discovered that many of my ideas about what faith is were actually caricatures of the real thing. In my view, faith only is defensible if it carries with it an intellectual logic and rationale. But you can't get all the way to faith purely on the basis of intellect. There still has to be that leap before you make that decision. But certainly, I would agree with what's already been said. What matters here is the truth. Either there is a God or there is not. If there is not, then let's not waste our time spending all these conversations and altering our lives in accordance with that assumption. But if there is, there can be no more important reality in any of our lives than that. What I realize is that science is not really an effective way to approach that question. Science explores the natural world. It is the only way to understand the natural world effectively. Its tools are designed for that. If God exists, then God cannot, in my view, be enclosed by the natural world. God is at least in part outside of that. And that tells you that the tools of science are not going to be effective in determining his existence or lack thereof. There must be other ways to pursue that. One of the compelling arguments which I continue to be drawn to, and which was put forward for me most effectively by the Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis, is the argument about the moral law. Why is it that we, of all the creatures on the planet, have this knowledge of what is right and wrong, even though we regularly don't adhere to that law? But we know it, and that's true of all cultures down through history. What is that about? Because I think one can argue that that moral law sometimes calls you to do things that are absolutely contrary to what Darwinian evolution would expect of you in terms of propagating your own DNA. And I find that to be a very interesting argument. I would not hang my faith on it, but I think it's an interesting argument. For me, science is one way of knowing. Faith is another way of knowing. I find no difficulty in having both of those coexist within me at any given moment, including right now. In that way, science becomes not only a way of discovering the natural world, but also a way of worshiping a God who had something to do with getting the whole thing going. My view, as far as evolution, is it's the only way to understand biology. It is absolutely incontrovertibly true in terms of our descent from a common ancestor. But I'm a theistic evolutionist. If God chose to use that mechanism to create you and me and everything else we see on this wonderful planet, who are we to say that wasn't an elegant means of creation? It's an incredibly elegant way to accomplish the goal. And for God, who is not limited in space or time, the apparent randomness of the process to us, because we're limited on that time axis, is not randomness to him. So for me, the God of the genome is also the God of the Bible. You can find him in a cathedral, or you can find him in a laboratory. And I am deeply troubled by the polarization that exists right now, especially in this country, between the extreme perspectives which say there can be no God because evolution has disproved it, and the creationist view which says evolution has to be wrong, you have to disbelieve what science is telling you with great, compelling rigor. There needs to be a recovery of the middle ground, where we always were down through the centuries, and which we seem to have lost in recent times. Not because we just decide it's too awkward to have the conversation, but because the conversation leads us to a happy harmony, which is where I have found great peace and great comfort.
We're going to open up this debate to those of you in the audience, and so if you want to start assembling at these microphones, you can start doing that right now. Meanwhile, as you hear this debate, so often you hear that scientists are really concerned that the power of religious groups is blocking further scientific research. Is that something, Dr. Carson, that you're concerned about, a trend in that direction?
Well, there's no question that one has to recognize that there is a difference between faith, which is, I think, what Dr. Collins was talking about, and religion. Two very different things. And, over the course of history, many religions have sprung up that really don't have a whole lot to do with my personal concept of a loving creator. They have a lot to do with how do you control people and how do you acquire power unto yourselves. And this continues to be the case today. And I think, the religious bodies have to be held to a higher standard. They do, in fact, have to deal with logic. They do have to deal with the things that are placed on the table by the evolutionists as well as other people. But I would caution and say also that the people who try to discard God on the basis of not being able to prove that he exists are not taking into consideration the fact that we have this higher cognitive portion of our brain that no other creature seems to have. Why do we have these incredible frontal lobes? Because we have the ability to extract information and to process information and to project information. We're the only creatures who can sit here and say, I'm going to envision a plan for 5 years from now, for 10 years from now, and I'm going to execute a series of steps to make sure that that comes to fruition. That requires way more than can be explained on the basis of cellular biology.
Let's get the atheist to jump in here.
Well, I would like to ask Dr. Carson then, at what point in the evolutionary divergence between the common ancestor of us and chimpanzees, or us and, say, rhesus monkeys, did this human faculty arise, And why do you need to postulate, given that presumably you believe in evolution, why do you need to, how do you reconcile the fact of evolution, because it is a fact, with the separation which you seem to be wanting to...
Well, thank you for asking that question, because, in fact, I don't believe in evolution. So
Dr. Collins and you can have a discussion about that.
We can, and I'll tell you the reason why. Evolution says that because there are these similarities, even though we can't specifically connect them, it proves that this is what happened. Well, let's say somebody came here from another planet after our planet has been destroyed by, terrorism and nuclear weapons and everything, and they find, some Volkswagens, and they find some Rolls Royces, and they look at them and they say, wow, these are really very similar, and they all have wheels and a transmission engine. Obviously, this Rolls Royce is much more sophisticated. It must have evolved from this Volkswagen. And if we look hard enough, we can find all the little things that will show us exactly how that evolution occurred. Well, you're welcome to believe that. I simply don't. Doesn't make you into a bad person because you believe that. And it doesn't make me into a good person because I don't believe it. But the point being, there are many different ways to look at these things. And Darwin himself, as you know, said that we would eventually have a mechanism, we would be sophisticated enough geologically to show completely the lineage from an amoeba to a man. He said it would probably take 50 to 100 years. Well, it's been 150 years. We still haven't found it. I suspect maybe one day you will. When you do find it, I will be all ears.
Dr. Dennett, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I'm interested that both Dr. Carson and Dr. Collins say that there's something that they think couldn't evolve, or at least that leads Dr. Collins to say that's my reason for believing in God. He cites our moral sense, and Dr. Carson cites our capacity to plan. But in fact, we have a lot of excellent research on the evolution of the moral sense, on the evolution of cooperation, and on the evolution of cognitive capacities to plan. So that the discontinuities that both of them see, they are important discontinuities with the rest of the biosphere, for sure. But they're precisely the areas where we are developing good evolutionary accounts. And the big difference, I think, Dr. Carson's sort of parody of evolutionary research is that evolution, again and again, it doesn't just find another fossil. It makes predictions that are then borne out. Stunning predictions that are borne out again and again across the world. We had actually a sort of few examples of that from Spencer Wells' talk. That's not just filling in the gaps. That's the real test of science, is being able to come up with novel predictions, and they happen every day by the hundreds.
Dr. Collins.
So I certainly respect the views being expressed, but let me say that this last couple of points seems to commit the error of applying in a very rigorous scientific way arguments about faith. I would call that scientism. What more important questions do we humans have to answer than, is there a God? Does he care about me? Why are we all here? What happens after we die? Is it not immediately apparent that science is poorly designed to answer those questions? And similarly, I would say science is poorly designed to assess the truth or falsity of faith. Surely one can look at the history of religions, and you can draw parallels between various belief systems, but I don't believe that will help you very much in deciding whether faith is true or false, because that series of intellectual approaches is not designed to tackle the issue that you most want to know about.
Let's jump out to our audience. We've got about 5 people lined up here, and we're going to try and get through all your questions, so keep them short, and if you can direct them to somebody in particular on the panel.
Okay, I think we're supposed to introduce ourselves. I'm Lindsay Worth. I did philosophy at Harvard, economics at Oxford, and now law at Yale. And I am particularly directing my question to Dr. Collins, but love to hear any answers. I hear people lots of times talking like you did about things that are outside the natural world, outside of space, outside of time, incredibly improbable, etc. And despite my overeducation and lots of smart friends trying to explain, I just don't understand what people like you are talking about. And I was wondering if you could help me understand and wrap my mind around what this is supposed to be.
Okay, well, I just enumerated some important questions that I think science can't answer, like why are we all here? How did the universe get started might be another one. Now, that is a question which science attempts to address. If you look at the way in which the physical constants that characterize the universe have their given values, it is astounding to note there are about 15 of these constants, from the gravitational constants to the strong and weak nuclear forces, for instance. Were they not precisely tuned to the exact values that they have, some of them to within 1 part in 10 to the 14th, then the universe could never have existed as anything other than gas, because there would not have been sufficient forces to allow coalescence of planets, stars, and ourselves. I find that pretty interesting, and I think that is outside of the realm of our current ability to explain scientifically, and you might therefore begin to speculate that that says something about theology. In fact, the noted astronomer Robert Jastrow, himself not a believer, talks about getting to this point and saying what an incredibly upsetting experience it was as you began to try to figure out that first 10 to the minus 43 seconds of what happened at the beginning of the universe. You get to the top of the mountain and you are greeted by a band of philosophers and theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Well, I think that's part of the answer to your question. And since others have promoted their books, let me say, yeah, I have a book coming out in 6 weeks called The Language of God. There are a few galley proofs up there on the table. And I would be very interested in the comments of any of this group on the arguments that are in that particular manuscript.
Quickly, jump in.
Just quickly, that's another instance of the argument from improbability. The universe, the fundamental constants are incredibly finely tuned. So what? God, if he exists, also has to be incredibly finely tuned. Therefore, you've explained exactly nothing.
Our next question.
Hi, my name is Ryan Keller. I study at Cambridge. My question is for Dr. Dawkins and Dr. Dennett. Dr. Dawkins, you mentioned before the idea of religion and science overlapping, and I want to take this into the realm of ethics. Nietzsche suggested that with the death of God, in the past we had always posited our ethical lives based on some metaphysical entity that was extra, outside of the world. If our attempt is to excise God and kind of the metaphysical ideas that undergird Western or secularized Christian Western society, what kind of basis do you see as establishing a new ethics? It seems that ethics are an important part of the human experience. Do you see evidence or facts in the material world that we could somehow derive an ethical worldview from, and would that be social Darwinism, or what would you think that would be? And that's for Dr. Dennett as well.
Emphatically not social Darwinism. If there's anything that we have to learn ethically from Darwinism, it is do the exact opposite of what the Darwinian worldview would tend to suggest. However, we don't have to be that pessimistic. If you look, as Dan Dennett was saying, you can provide a rather good Darwinian account of where human ethics come from. It would take too long to go into it. His book and various other books discuss this. We can make an account of not just the obvious things, which are what the sorts of proto-ethics that non-human animals have, but we can also generalize that as a kind of misfiring to produce the kind of ethics that we have in humans. I don't see that as a major problem, even if I did. Even if, for example, my scientific or scientistic, as it's been called, worldview, said that there is no good account of it, or rather, suppose it said that we are all immoral, selfish, and horrible. My answer for that would be, again, so what? It doesn't affect the truth of what's going on in the universe. If it's true that the facts of the universe are horrible and ruthless and callous and awful, then tough, let's live with it. Fortunately, it isn't like that, but if it were, we would have to live with it. You can't change the way the universe is just to suit human desires.
Dr. Dennett, he just wants to jump in there.
you mentioned Nietzsche, and I'd just like to remind you that Nietzsche was brilliant on the ignobility of the traditional idea that the reason people are good is so that they will get reward in heaven, that they need the carrot and the stick of heaven and hell in order to be good. I think that is, I think the good news is that people don't believe that. And the really good news is, it's a good thing they don't believe it because it's such a paltry and childish notion of why people are good. I look around the world and I see people that are wonderful, engaged people. I'm sure many of the people in this room who their morality does not depend on a belief in a supreme being at all. And I think it's very important that we break the habitual link, especially in this country, between being godless and being immoral. I think that's just a calumny and it should stop.
Okay, now the counterpoint.
So I guess I just wanted to comment that I'm always interested when this discussion about ethics and morality comes up, that you would expect an evolutionist, especially one who has promoted the idea that evolution is pretty much uncaring about anything except propagation of selfish genes and blind, pitiless indifference, as Dawkins has described it, that carries with it. Why then would we, as creatures who are products of that process, if that's all there is, suddenly here on this stage be worrying about morality, about altruism, about doing good? This is again the paradox that I see as not sufficiently explained by evolutionary biology or sociobiology, because it calls us to do things that are contrary to that. If I'm walking down the bank of a river and I hear a call for help for somebody who is drowning in the middle of the river, and that person turns out to be my worst enemy, evolution would say, let him go. Less of his DNA, more of mine. And yet I think all of you would recognize that in that circumstance, you would at least have that impulse, that deep sense that the right thing to do is to try to save that person, even if you put yourself at risk. You may not act upon that impulse, but I bet you'll have it. So where is that coming from? And how can we so easily discount that on the basis of blind, pitiless indifference?
It's no more paradoxical than the fact that we use contraception. You, as a Darwinian, know perfectly well that using contraception is a deeply un-Darwinian thing to do. We have absolutely no problem with that. It's a fact that our big brains, because they're big brains, enable us to override that Darwinian imperative, and in exactly the same way we can override the Darwinian imperative to be selfish. It's just not a problem, or if it is a problem, it's one whose solution stares us in the face every time we use a contraceptive.
Let's see if we can go through a couple more questions here. Yes.
Hello, I'm Tarnab Khaitan from India, and I study human rights law in Oxford. I want to push the non-atheists, the believers, to show Richard's hypothesis B. I'm willing to concede that evolution is, for a moment, that evolution is wrong and that science is inadequate as a discipline to explain it. I want you to show to me what is the difference in the ontology of God and unicorns. Why are the two concepts different from each other?
God's and what?
Unicorns.
Oh, unicorns.
Who'd like to conquer the unicorn? Ben?
I don't know if I want to deal with unicorns, but but I will say that one has to recognize that it's absolutely impossible to prove the existence of God. You simply can't do it. It's something you have to feel. And it's what I was getting at earlier when I talked about that thing that distinguishes us from all the other animals. And, you know, the incredible complexity of our brains that allows us to have that vertical relationship. It's a feeling. And, you know, we, as sophisticated as we are with all of our MRIs and our PET scanners and things like that, we have never been able to discover the origin of a thought. We don't know the origin of a feeling. We can talk about electrophysiological responses, but we cannot take it to the next level. We cannot define that. We cannot put that in a box. I think that's one of the things that makes us different. And, I will be the first to tell you that I cannot in any way explain it. I cannot prove it. And by the same token, my colleagues here cannot prove theirs either. So it's a matter of how much faith do you have. I simply don't have enough faith to believe that something as complex as our ability to rationalize, to think and plan, and have a moral sense of what's right and wrong just appeared. I don't have enough faith to believe it.
Dr. Dennett, can you explain the origin of a thought or an emotion?
Yes, but not in a minute. This is a wonderful occasion. It's a thrill. I'm honored, and I'm particularly thrilled by this panel discussion because on my left, Dr. Carson, on my right, Dr. Collins, have underlined the importance of the questions that I've been actually spending my career on. How do you get the evolution of consciousness? That's the stumbling block for Dr. Carson. How do you get the evolution of morality? That's the stumbling block for Dr. Collins. And they both say, I just can't see how that's possible. I think it's because they haven't tried hard enough. It's hard to do. And that's what I've been trying to do my career, and I really think they should look more closely at the work that has been done on the evolution of cognition and consciousness.
What is the answer? What is the answer? I'm waiting.
You don't have time. I mean,
Read Dennett's books.
that's the answer.
Let's take a couple more questions. I think we have time for just a few more questions.
Could I ask a question from over here?
My name is Herman Swart. I'm at Oxford doing a DPhil in psychology. Dr. Dawkins, you alluded to earlier that some of the arguments for the existence of God often rely on like the God of the gaps theory. Because we can't explain something, therefore God must exist. But what about scientists who run the risk of saying because we can explain something, there is no need for God to exist? Surely they're falling in the same trap, in the same hole as those who go around with the God of the gaps theory.
There's an infinite number of things that we can't disprove. You might say because science can explain something, can explain just about everything, but not quite, it's wrong to say, therefore, we don't need God. It's also, I suppose, wrong to say we don't need the flying spaghetti monster, unicorns, to revert to the previous question, which was never answered, and Thor, Wotan, Jupiter, fairies at the bottom of the garden. There's an infinite number of things that some people have at one time or another believed in, an infinite number of things that nobody has believed in. If there's not the slightest reason to believe in any of those things, why bother? The onus is on somebody who says, I want to believe in God, flying spaghetti monster, fairies, or whatever it is. It's not up to us to disprove it.
But may I say, to those that are promoting the atheist perspective as the only logical conclusion, because I used to hold to that quite rigorously as well. I think there's a real flaw here in the logic. Imagine that you are asked to draw a circle that includes all of the knowledge that will ever be determined about the universe in every possible sphere. I think all of us would draw a very large circle. Now draw within that circle what you know. Would that not be a subset? A very small one, I think, unless one is afflicted with great arrogance, a very small subset indeed. Now suppose that the knowledge of the existence of God is outside of your circle. That has a serious mathematical likelihood when you consider the proportionalities here. How then can it be a logical statement to say, I know with certainty that there is no God? That seems like the strongest kind of fallacy. Agnosticism, I grant you, a more intellectually honest approach. Strong atheism, to say there can be no God and I know that's the case, falls apart on the altar of logical debate, and really, I think, ought to be considered as its own form of blind faith.
We're going to answer that. We're just telling you.
Well, I don't know why anybody would assert that what you call strong atheism.
Oh, has Professor Dawkins not done so?
No.
The God delusion?
Oh, we have a convert.
This is truly ridiculous. This is truly ridiculous. I accept wholeheartedly that the circle of things that I know is minute compared to the circle of things which might be known. There's an enormous amount that we don't know. It could include all kinds of weird things, and it certainly will. But it's highly unlikely that it will just happen to include Jupiter or Thor or Yahweh. I mean, why would one think that it would assume these petty, parochial little things that in history people have happened to have thought about?
Highly unlikely, or
it's going to be
Highly unlikely.
highly unlikely.
Ah. So you're
Not
agnostic.
impossible. The flying spaghetti monster's not impossible.
We're agnostic about that.
I think you have to be careful to separate from true faith, you know, the myriad of myths that have come about through permutations of religion for control of people. And just because those exist doesn't mean that there isn't a God and doesn't mean that there isn't legitimate faith. I think you just have, you can't throw them all into one basket and say, because that's so ridiculous, the rest of it is too.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, so let's start right here.
Great. So this panel is about science and religion, but, my name is Lori Zephyrin. I'm actually a medical doctor as well, and I'm a White House Fellow this year. So this panel is about science and religion. Ultimately, what influences our thought on religion are our cultural beliefs, our experiences growing up. And it'd be interesting to get an understanding of how one is able to separate those experiences from the scientific facts. And I don't know if Dr. Carson and Dr. Dawkins, since there seems to be some polar opposites there, can comment on some of their experiences and how they're able to separate that from some of their scientific beliefs.
Okay. Well, experiences are clearly what have given me my faith in God. You know, you'd have to read my book.
I've read your book.
We're selling a lot of books here today.
And you would begin to recognize that, for instance, you know, as a teenager, I was a completely out of control, angry person trying to stab people. And, you know, I had an experience one day. And I began to recognize at that point that there was something else outside of me. And I began to connect myself with that, and my life completely changed. Some people say that's baloney. You have to experience it yourself.
Dr. Dennett, do you want to jump in there? Are you?
Well, I thought Richard
I don't think that my personal experiences are of the slightest interest to anybody. I care about what's true, and that means I care about evidence. And my personal, anecdotal, private experiences are not evidence for anything.
Just in summary, if we can even embark on a summary, I just want to give each of you 15 seconds to let us know whether you think we are any further along in resolving this debate today than we were 100 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. And I'll start with you, Ben.
Okay, well, in 15 seconds, I would simply ask people to ask yourself the question. You know, I was talking earlier today about risk. Ask yourself the question, if there is a God, what is the risk of not believing in him versus believing in him? If there is no God, what is the risk of believing in him versus not believing in him? Ask yourself that question tonight while you're in bed.
As I was flying through a thunder lightning storm last night from California to California, I know how I answered that question. Dr. Dawkins.
Dr. Carson has just invoked what's known as Pascal's wager. It assumes that the God that confronts you when you reach the pearly gates is indeed a God who cares passionately about whether you believe in him. If I were God, I wouldn't care so much whether somebody believed in me as whether I was a good person, whether I was an honest person, whether I spent my life honestly seeking the truth. And if, as Bertrand Russell said when somebody asked him, what would you say if you found yourself confronted by God? If God challenged you and said, why didn't you believe in me? Russell said, not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence. And God would, I think any God worth worshipping would respect that far more than somebody who believed in him just because it was the safe option to do so.
Dr. Dennett.
Dr. Carson speaks about risk, and I approve wholeheartedly of his encouraging you to take a risk. And here's a risk I want to encourage you to take. Risk subjecting your own faith to scientific study. Let science lead, as Dr. Kierstead said earlier today. If your faith is strong enough, it should be able to withstand a very careful scrutiny of how it arose, how it evolved, why it sits in your brain the way it does, how it defends itself. Are you ready to subject your faith to the same sort of scientific scrutiny that you're prepared to address to the other problems in your life? I think you should risk it.
Dr. Collins.
Albert Einstein famously said, religion without science is blind. I think Professor Dennett was making that argument that you need to apply great reason and logic to faith. And I strongly agree with that. The second part of Einstein's comment was that science without religion is lame. Clearly, there are many ways of knowing. Science is one of them. As you've listened to this discussion, I hope it's caused some self-examination about what do you believe and why do you believe it. There can be no more important question that you'll wrestle with during this weekend or for the rest of your life than is there a God?